All right, we were looking on Friday at Jeremiah chapter 30 to 33, these four great chapters where Jeremiah looks forward and anticipates the restoration that God is going to bring for the nation of Judah and also for the nation of Israel that has already gone into captivity. And as Jeremiah speaks these words, at least within the context of Jeremiah, it is at the time when two of the three exiles from Judah to Babylon had already taken place. Jeremiah has to, within that context, speak to those exiles in Babylon, send a letter to them and say that God is not going to bring them back during that generation. They were to settle in and to establish their homes in Babylon, that God was not going to bring a physical restoration of a remnant until 70 years from 605 BC. And basically at that point, God's clock was going, and certainly by that point, the generation to which he was speaking would be dead. But God, as he speaks and says, okay, my plan for you is not a plan ultimately of disaster, it's a plan of hope, it's a plan for good. And that leads within the context, Jeremiah to write down the message of hope that God had given to him, not only for his generation, but obviously as the writing becomes inscripturated, the message becomes inscripturating, that those in exile and the continuing exile of Israel, where they do not return en masse as a complete entity back to the land, and have not to this day, that the words of Jeremiah continue to ring on this is what God is going to do. That he is going to bring a healing. He is going to bring a restoration. He is going to bring forgiveness as far as the people of Israel is concerned, and establish them back in the land. And as we saw, particularly in chapter 31, under the provisions of a new covenant. And Jeremiah is to show his faith in that hope in chapter 32 by buying land, because a day will come in the future when once again there will be the restoration of the land, the redemption of land, the buying and selling of land that will take place in a future day. And so Jeremiah redeems land from his family at that time, even though the Babylonians control that land. And his family would not have access to that land again until the restoration would come. And Jeremiah wonders why God is doing that. And God says, all right, there's going to be a period of captivity that is going to come upon the people because of their sin, and then ultimately there will be a time of restoration. And in chapter 33, Jeremiah, as he looks forward again to that period of restoration, says it's a time when God is going to fulfill his covenants to David and to the Levites. He's going to fulfill the priestly covenant of Numbers chapter 25. He's going to fulfill the Davidic covenant of 2 Samuel chapter 7. And of course, the time when these covenants will be fulfilled is tied in to when God will make the new covenant. And as Israel will experience the new covenant, then they will reap the blessings of the Abrahamic covenant, implicit, because of how Jeremiah begins in chapter 30, speaking about the land promised to the forefathers, and comes back and speaks about the land and the promises that were given to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob at the end of chapter 33, the fact that he would not reject the seed. And so the land is emphasized in chapter 30. The seed who will inherit that land is emphasized in chapter 33. And uniquely, under the Spirit of God, Jeremiah brings it all together. in the sense that, all right, God has entered into that Abrahamic covenants. The Mosaic covenant was the means, our Diane Block's terminology, covenant with Israel number 1, was to be the potential means because of Israel's sin, Judah's hard-heartedness. Then that covenant is broken. It will not be the instrumentation. It's irreparably broken. And so God is going to enter into another covenant, a new covenant. And certainly as he speaks of that new covenant, all exegetes see within these passages in Jeremiah a very definite echo of what is in Deuteronomy chapter 30, verses 1 to 10. Even those who would not take particularly our viewpoint, that is my viewpoint, on Deuteronomy 29 and 30, still see, even if they see that as being renewal of the Sinaitic covenant, that Moses goes beyond that to start to speak, anticipate what God was going to do through the new covenant. And so we come to Jeremiah, and certainly within this restoration passage, there are these two major interpretive issues that come before us. The issue in chapter 31, verse 22, which is universally agreed by all exegetes of Jeremiah, is impossible to get the exact meaning of it now. All we can do is say, all right, within the context, this is what Jeremiah is saying. And what exactly is he speaking about? He is looking at the restoration of how God is going to take this faithless daughter of Israel. He is going to take Ephraim, who was this wayward son, this faithless daughter, and he is going to, in Jeremiah's word, create a new thing in the earth. Now, this is again within the context of the restoration. The restoration of Israel is going to be like something that is unnatural, that cannot be explained by normal human affairs. And then he gives this very cryptic statement: a woman will encompass a man. And exactly what is he saying at that point? Well, early church fathers, and so then developed within the church, was that this was a cryptic way of speaking of the virgin birth. A woman will encompass, that is, within her womb, she will surround a man. And it's a unique thing. It is a new thing in the earth that has never taken place before. And as you can see, even though Harrison with a question mark and Ryken, who also takes position C, both of them see this as a potential application. You have to realize that. Neither Harrison or Ryken would say that this is specifically what Jeremiah had in mind, but it is a legitimate application once we're this side of the New Testament on what he might be speaking about, a virgin with a child. I have to demur and say I don't think that was in Jeremiah's mind, and I don't think it's how we are to interpret or even apply this passage today. It probably is more, and most would say within this context, the woman, we've already seen a faithless daughter, which is Israel. A woman will encompass a man. The woman probably here is standing for Israel. And will encompass a man is the new thing that she is going to embrace her husband. And here's the new thing, because according to the Old Testament's standards on divorce, that once a woman was divorced, and realize the reason for the divorce in Jeremiah is because she had turned to what? In adultery, she had turned and embraced other idols. That is spiritual adultery. But it is true that through the judgments, Israel is going to be cured of that. That is, of idolatry. They're not going to be cured of seeking to work their way to God and seeking to establish their own righteousness before God. Romans chapter 9 and 10. But they are going to be cured of idolatry. So in a sense, even though they play the harlots, much like we'll see with Hosea and Gomer, in the end, they are not married. And as Hosea 2 points out to us, God in the future is going to court and woo and once again win Israel as his bride. And there will be once again the marriage that will take place, though now the marriage is not on the basis of the old covenant, but on the basis of the new covenant. And so this is Israel embracing her husband Yahweh, this unique thing that will take place in the future, and particularly because of Israel's history in the past, it certainly is a new thing. That as a whole, as a people, they will embrace Yahweh. This is in Bible Knowledge Commentary. This is also in the MacArthur Study Bible Notes. There is also, because the word encompass has the idea of watching out for, protecting, that is, leading a man, that at this point, Israel, and now the man is not necessarily the Lord, but now Israel, who has been basically in her experience subservient to the nations, will now be seen uniquely, because it was the man's responsibility to lead, protect. Now Israel will lead and protect. Like a woman, this is a new thing. This is something that has not been seen previously. And B and C are the two major interpretations, as you can see, to this day. But ultimately, like Feinberg, who writes in the EBC, that you can list the interpretive positions, but in the end, it's very, very hard to say, well, what is this new thing exactly? This cryptic statement, it is a woman it is a woman encompassing a man. And how would you explain that? Well, Jeremiah really doesn't give a whole lot to explain it. We just have to realize it is an image, it is a figure of what is going to take place in the future for Israel, that there will be a new thing, there will be a new experience as far as Israel is concerned. And this cryptic statement is said. And so Feinberg, in the end, just lists the positions and just says it's impossible to know at this point exactly what the interpretation is. And I guess at this point I would be pretty much in Feinberg's camp. I have my feet solidly planted in midair. I'm dogmatic on the fact that no one can be dogmatic on what the meaning of this passage is. But we have to state it because all commentators say this is the hardest passage in Jeremiah to interpret, and we'll just leave it at that. Probably a greater issue, and we won't get into discussion on that because really in the end we can share opinions until the day is long and really not come to a definitive conclusion on that. But certainly there is much more discussion about the new covenants, and not so much its relationship to Israel, because there's a fair amount of agreement within the context of Jeremiah and the greater theological context of the Old Testament, that Jeremiah envisions this new covenant replacing the old covenant that God made with Israel at Sinai. That this will be the replacement in the future. Obviously, a clear reading of Jeremiah, I think, and as I said, commentators are agreed on that. The problem is that now we live this side of the Last Supper. We live this side of the finished work of Jesus Christ. And certainly when we come to Luke chapter 22, Jesus, as he is instituting the bread and the cup, in verse 20, when he takes the cup, says, "This cup which is poured out for you is the new covenant in my blood." Now, at this point, he is speaking to his disciples. They, now like us, having read the Old Testament, when we hear this is the blood of the new covenant, I mean, where in the Old Testament do you find the words new covenant? Jeremiah chapter 31. And even in the Sinaitic covenant. What do you have in Exodus chapter 24? You have a sacrifice and Moses taking blood and both sprinkling the stones with the 10 words, the essential requirements that God has given to Israel and the people. In other words, the covenant was initiated with the shedding of blood. All right? Now, if the new covenant is going to replace the old covenant, as the old covenant was instituted with the shedding of blood. Now, Jeremiah hasn't said that in Jeremiah chapter 31, but he has certainly set up the analogy between the old and the new. Then we anticipate that the new also is initiated by the shedding of blood. And here is Jesus saying that the cup which represents his blood, the life that is going to be poured out upon the cross, is the cup of the new covenants. And certainly we start to see even more of that imagery when you come to Hebrews 8, 9, and 10. All right, the writer of Hebrews makes it very, very clear in Hebrews 8:6, but now he's obtained a more excellent ministry, that is, the Messiah, the one who is the mediator of the new covenant, by as much as he is also the mediator of a better covenant. He is the mediator, which has been enacted on better promises. Right? So here is the writer as he is speaking. And notice he uses the present tense. He is the mediator of a better covenant, which has, then using the perfect, been enacted as a past event that continues to have present consequences, which has been enacted on better promises. It has and continues to be enacted, established, ordained. So the idea is it has been and now stands established. And then he goes on in verses 8 to 12 to give the single longest continuous quotation from the Old Testament, where he quotes our passage in Jeremiah chapter 31. And then says in verse 13, when he said a new one, a new covenant, he has made the first obsolete. But whatever is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to disappear. So as he speaks here, he talks about the fact as he is reading, as he is writing to his audience, the present tense there is becoming obsolete and growing old, means that as far as its outward ramifications are concerned, was on the verge of disappearing. And so in chapter 9, verse 1, not even the first covenant had regulations. Even the first had regulations of divine worship and earthly sanctuary had. It's the imperfect looking at what was true in the past. He speaks about some of those regulations and how now they have been superseded by what Jesus Christ has done. And in fact, he talks about the offering and speaks in chapter 10, verses 15 to 18, again about the new covenants that will lead to the forgiveness of sins. Now, where there is forgiveness of these sins, there is no longer an offering for sin. The once and for all offering of Jesus Christ has rendered the old covenants null and void and on the verge of being inoperative. Because we believe that Hebrews is written sometime in the mid to latter 60s, where just a few years hence the temple will be destroyed, the sacrifices will come to an end, and even the priesthood will no longer be able to function. In fact, to this day, after AD 70, no Jew knows whether they are of the family of Aaron or not. I mean, no Jewish individual today knows their tribal ancestry. All those records were lost in the destruction of the temple. How great was the destruction of the temple and the scattering of Israel? They have lost their tribal identity, an identity that continued on. I mean, in Luke chapter 2, the tribal identity of Hannah is given to us. So it was known up until AD 70. It's lost after that. So you can't have a priesthood because no one knows who the priests are anymore. You can't have a sacrifice because there is no altar, there is no temple. And of course the Israelites themselves recognize that. And to this day, even though there are preparations being made for the reinstitution of sacrifices, when God, through his Messiah, will reveal who the priests are, they will be ready to reconstitute sacrifices. But to this day, Israel in the sovereign hand of God, there are no sacrifices. But in some way, as the writer of Hebrews speaks, there is a certain sense in which the new covenant is present today. I mean, you can't read Hebrews 8, 9, and 10, and we've hit some of the high points of that, without realizing that, all right, the new, the mediator has come. His death has taken place. And in some way, the new covenant is present. And particularly in its aspect of forgiveness of sins today. Well, how do we resolve this? Because Jeremiah makes it very, very clear, in fact, restated in Hebrews chapter 8, that this is a covenant that he will make with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. So the majority position is position number 2. The church fulfills the new covenant. The old covenant has come to an end, rendered inoperative through the death of Jesus Christ, and even its outward manifestation came to an end in AD 70. And with the death of Christ, the new covenant is fully in effect. Now, since Jeremiah says that the covenant will be made, this new covenant with Israel and Judah, that means what about those who experience the new covenant forgiveness today? Well, this is the covenantal approach. We are the new Israel. So Jeremiah, he was thinking about the literal seed of Abraham. But we need to realize today that on the basis of the New Testament, we are the spiritual seed of Abraham, all those in Jesus Christ. And so Jeremiah was using language that he and his audience was understand, but now this side of the cross we recognize that we are the true Israel. We are the true spiritual seed of Abraham, and we are the recipients fully of the new covenants. It's interesting that just before this and just after this, he does talk about the fact that he's going to plant the seed of Abraham back in the land. It is the house of Israel, the house of Judah, and reestablish Jerusalem. But once you've gone symbolic, you can make that symbolic as well. So the land stands for our present blessing. The New Jerusalem, Jerusalem stands for the New Jerusalem we're anticipating, which is seen within the present Zion, which is the church. You can just start, once you have said that this means something different than what it means within the context. Today, you can just start opening and saying whatever you want it to mean. There has been another position that has pretty much died out, but was very, very strong in the mid part of the 20th century. And that is that this new covenant is with Israel. There is no relationship of this new covenant with the church. So what is Jesus speaking about? What is the writer of Hebrews speaking about? Another new covenant. And so this position, and you can see it in the old Dallas writers, in Chaffe's Systematic Theology, in Walvoord's Millennial Kingdom, that they posited that there are two new covenants. That when Jesus died because of Israel's rejection, there was a new covenant that was put into effect for the church. The church is under this new covenant that will come to an end with the end of the church age, and then God will make the new covenant Jeremiah was speaking about with Israel and Judah. So that this new covenant in Jeremiah is with Israel only and has no relationship to the church. Well, I beg to differ on that, as I've already said in Luke 22, and the disciples here, this is the blood of the new covenant. They're thinking, oh yeah, this is going to be the covenant with the church, not with Israel. This is the second new covenant. Well, there's no way you can understand that. Even when you get to Hebrews, Hebrews makes it very clear that the new covenant replaces the old covenants with exactly the same context as Jeremiah. Now, along with that, with position A, I would negate position B for the simple reason that the New Testament, if this is the key to understanding the Old Testament, the New Testament writers have done a poor job of explicitly stating that the church is the new Israel. We'll get to this in 601, but covenantalists camp on Galatians chapter 16 with an unnatural use, not a predominant use of Kai within that passage, and they camp on it because if their understanding is right, that peace be upon, let's read it. I say it, that pops right out of my mind. Galatians chapter 6, verse 16. And those who will walk by this rule, peace and mercy be upon them and upon the Israel of God. And our covenantal friends want to make that last and even. Who walk according to this peace, rule, peace and mercy be upon them, even upon the Israel of God. Now, why do they want to do that? Because that then would make this the only explicit place within the New Testament where, and within this context of Galatians, Gentile believers are called the Israel of God, the new Israel. And you can read Hendrickson and others who go off and, invest this meaning, and here it is, it's clear. And that helps us to appreciate all the rest of the imagery of the New Testament, because here explicitly it says we are the Israel of God. Interestingly, we'll see when we get there, that's not the major position of exegetes on the passage. Even those who do not have a dispensational bent still say that basically the copulative and is the best way to take that, and within the context. All right, not only are there Gentiles who walk according to the rule, but there are also true Israelites, or, as some believe, anticipating the eschatological salvation of Israel, who will walk by the rule of God. But so the majority position among exegetes is not that this is an explicit statement concerning the church being the new Israel. All right, without that, there is no other within the New Testament. So if this is the key to unlock the meaning of the Old Testament for the New Testament church, it's interesting the New Testament writers were not clearer to make the statements so you don't miss it. I mean, why didn't the Spirit just make it so clear with some explicit statements that evangelical covenantalists and dispensationalists would not be having this debate still to this day? But nevertheless, in some way, the church participates in, if I might put it this way, in some existing way, a new covenant, because Christ now has died. And as Hebrews says, in some way, the new covenant has been established. And two positions have vied, and do realize that in position C, this is not just a dispensational statement. It is also a historical premillennial or covenantal premillennial statement as well. And even some amillennials are bending toward position C, that there is a partial spiritual fulfillment in the church, but full fulfillment for Israel later. There are men like John Murray, Wilhelm van Gemeren. Well, van Gemeren claims to be a premillennialist of his own definition, but so we'll stay with Murray since he never changed the definition. He was an amillennialist till the day that he died, but they hold position C on the basis of Romans 11, believing there will be an eschatological salvation for literal ethnic Israel in the final generation of the church age. Murray holds that. And that there will be a full fulfillment on the spiritual aspect of forgiveness of sin and incorporation within the church by Israel in the future. What I'm trying to say is C is not just a dispensational position. And that is the term, and a number of men on our faculty here will use this terminology that there has been a partial fulfillment in the church, a beginning, well, partial. It's our covenantal friends that will go back to George Ladd and say there's been an inauguration. That's the already, and then the fullness is going to come in the not yet. I'm not sure we quite use that same terminology, but certainly there is a fulfillment in the church, and particularly from Hebrews chapter 10, the fulfillment is that through the finished work of Christ and the at least initiation of the spiritual aspects of the new covenant, we enjoy forgiveness. And usually tied in with that is we also enjoy the gift of the Holy Spirit, which Jeremiah doesn't speak about, but Ezekiel will in Ezekiel chapter 36. So that, I think to use Homer Kent's terminology, which then is used within our theology classes here, that the soteriological aspects of the new covenant are fulfilled in the church today. But that does not negate the fact that there will be a full eschatological fulfillment of the new covenant when Israel is saved, when Jesus Christ returns in the future. I probably lean with a number of other faculty members to position D, that the basis of the new covenant today is the finished work of Jesus Christ. Christ is not going to die again. And so in that sense, the mediation of the new covenant has taken place. Yet there are two parties to any covenants. And the parties were, in Jeremiah 31, Israel/Judah, and Yahweh, who we know now, obviously the Lord, was incarnate in Jesus. Jesus is the mediator. He is party one, and yet through Israel's rejection of him, the new covenant with Israel has not gone into effect. Yet, as believers, both Jew and Gentile during this age, Galatians 3, we are united with Jesus, the mediator of the covenants, that in that sense, based upon his finished work, in that sense, has already taken place, and through our union with Jesus Christ, we receive the spiritual benefits of the new covenant with full fulfillment for Israel later. Now you'll notice there's a fine distinction between position C and D. The fine distinction is that those in position D don't want to use the $64,000 word fulfillment. No, not church. Fulfillment. So, I lean toward that in taking position D, though I recognize it is not that far different except for substituting the word benefit instead of the word fulfillment, with at least the dispensational friends of position C. In other words, when we here at TMS speak about those who hold C and D, in the practical ramifications, there's really not much difference. It's just that one group will use and has no problem using the word fulfillment, and the others are a little hesitant to use that term and would rather use the term benefit. Because the institution of a covenant, as we have seen, takes two parties entering into the covenant. And Israel, by their rejection of Christ, has not yet entered in to that covenant. And yet we're grafted into Christ. And since he is the mediator of the new covenant, we receive its benefits. Now, realize that position C and D both talk about the fact we receive the benefits. It's what is the basis of the benefits? Is it fulfillment? A partial fulfillment? Or is what Jeremiah said, and obviously even those who take position C, don't see this as complete and total fulfillment today. Even our covenantal premill friends don't see the full and total fulfillment today, because they have the already but not yet. The not yet is the full and complete fulfillment. Well, usually I have a whole hour to answer questions. We have about 5 minutes at this point. Steve?
For Jewish believers, even like the beginning of the church was really in Jerusalem, do you think that they would fall under C because they are actually kind of beginning to
No, I would say they're still D, because Jeremiah 31 is talking about the whole house of Israel, the household of Judah. That the fact that, okay, no one will speak to their neighbor anymore, all will know the Lord. That is not an experience that is seen even in the early chapters of Acts. So I would still say, looking back upon that, Paul still speaks in chapter 11 of that being the remnant of the present age, of which he becomes a part. That, yes, that remnant is an anticipation. The remnant during the present age is the anticipation that God is going to fully fulfill the promise to all of Israel in the future, in Romans 11, 25 and 26. So, and it is the passage in Romans. It was Murray's exegesis of Romans for the original NIC volume that led him to say that you can't understand Paul any other way from the fact that there is some kind of national salvation still anticipated for Israel. And he then was able to work that into his amillennial schema. So that, and as I said, thanks to Murray, in the last generation, this has become more and more of a point among even amillennial commentators. It's not become a majority amillennial position, but certainly that they're taking a more serious look at God's future relationship with national Israel. And of course, those of us who are dispensationalists have said, welcome, we've been here for a long time. But then, some of those who take position C, our covenantal pre-mill friends say, welcome, we've been here for a long time. To you dispensationalists who finally have seen the light. So sometimes there's good-natured kidding. Sometimes, I'm sorry to say, even among Christians, it gets to be pretty brutal on almost questioning someone's salvation when they hold a little different position in these areas. Krause.
So would you say then that the church receiving the spiritual benefits of the new covenant is part of the mystery of what Paul addresses in?
Yeah, something not clearly revealed in the Old Testament. Yes, the whole present age, and the fact that God has brought together Jew and Gentile into one body, that we also participate, either in fulfillment or in benefits of Jesus Christ, in union with Him. Yeah, that's part of the mystery of this present age that was not revealed within the Old Testament. Now, once you say that as far as a mystery, you are saying this is not revealed in the Old Testament. Therefore, Jeremiah's words, if we're going to take them fully literally, and the same thing when we get to Ezekiel, has to speak about a real Israel, a real land, a real participation in the covenants, that they will experience forgiveness, receive the Spirit, and receive the blessings of Israel in the future. It means a real, literal Davidic king who will sit upon a real, literal Davidic throne, ruling over a real, literal Israel and literal Gentile nations for a literal 1,000 years. Have I covered pretty much all my bases? Now, the 1,000 years is also a mystery. It's not revealed in the Old Testament. But what is anticipated of what the New Testament is speaking about in Revelation 20, of Christ coming and believers ruling and reigning with Him, as you go back to the Old Testament, that's looking to the scion of David, who will resurrect Old Testament saints and living Israelite saints at that point and go into this time when they will rule and reign, with Christ as the head nation over the nations of the earth. And all we're saying is that no matter how you explain C or D, what is taking place in the present age, that does not negate a literal fulfillment for what the prophets told Israel in the Old Testament. That whatever is taking place, either in partial fulfillment or benefits because of union with Christ in the present age, which is a mystery, not revealed in the Old Testament, says what the Old Testament is anticipating, therefore, will take place after this mystery is completed. And of course, within that, I have just given you basically the dispensational schema of things. Our pre-mill covenantal and our all-mill future for literal Israel would not quite go so far on saying all of these things are literal in the future, because we see a symbolic interpretation, or a symbolic working out of this today. And so could there also be a symbolic working out of this in the future? And that's where a lad ended up in his life, saying I'm a premillennialist because that's what Revelation 20 speaks about. Romans 11 talks about a future literal salvation of Israel. So I hold those two things. I hold that there will be a future eschatological fulfillment of the salvation of national Israel, which will take place beyond the church age, and he even made the millennium symbolic, at a future period after what is spiritually taking place in the church today will come to an end. But since we're all the people of God, it is just basically taking today in the church and seeing it take place in Israel in the future. And you see, that's what happens. I mean, even Ladd shows you that, and he started out dispensational and slowly but surely moved to a covenantal perspective, and in his life basically had a symbolic future with an outworking of salvation for national Israel in some way like it is today within the church. And that's probably, as Van Gemeren speaks about a premillennialist in his own understanding, pretty much I would say, because none of us really understand Van Gemeren's position completely, because I'm not sure Van Gemeren understands his position completely. But I think it's probably a reflection of Ladd, that there is a literal fulfillment for national Israel in some sense beyond the church age, but that's all I can say because everything else is symbolic. Maybe he's right. I don't think he is. I to this day am a committed literalist as far as the promises given to Israel in the Old Testament are concerned, and I see that fulfillment taking place during the millennial age.
Would point D be more of a single meaning hermeneutic and point C not so much?
Well, I don't want to quite go that far, Carlos, but yes, point D is more the single meaning hermeneutic. And since you have me for hermeneutics, you know that I live and die by that principle. So I'm living it. And some of my friends on the faculty say I might be dying on it. But I will live and die. And yes, and that is what I am, seeking, that the Old Testament makes it very, very clear that this is the new covenants is a covenant that God makes with Israel. You have two parties. One party rejects it during the present age, and yet we're united with Christ, the other party of the covenant, which means that united with Christ, we can gain the benefits without saying there is a fulfillment in any way of what Jeremiah was speaking about in Jeremiah 31. So yes, I guess I lean toward position D because of my single meaning hermeneutic. Those who will take a potential double meaning or double application have a easier time taking position C. But as I said, okay, that becomes a hermeneutical discussion, because in ramifications during the present age, at least on the dispensational understanding of C and D, there is really not any difference in its outworking to believers in the present age. All right, one more question and then we're done. I'll leave the microphone on during break if you want to ask more questions. Chris.
I have a question about the national salvation of Israel. It's, now when we look at the New Testament, they were waiting upon the Messiah for physical deliverance, so to speak. Will their eschatological salvation be because they embrace the gospel, or is it
Yes.
that they will embrace the coming of the Messiah?
Yes.
Both.
Well, they can't embrace the Messiah without embracing the gospel. They can't embrace the gospel without embracing Messiah, because the gospel is the good news concerning what God has done through the finished work of the Messiah.
Would that mean then, as far as the gospel will have to penetrate Israel then?
Yes, it will. And we've also got to put, Ezekiel 20 here is also going to purge out the rebels. All Israel is going to be saved because everyone who comes back into the land will be a truly regenerate Israelite who's embraced the gospel, embraced Christ, received forgiveness, receives the Spirit. Now that doesn't mean that every last Israelite, when Jesus returns, is going to be saved. There are going to be rebels. There are going to be those who do not respond. And God is going to separate them. They're not going to go into the land. They won't participate. But the end result will be when they are taken away, what is left? A complete, total nation that is saved. And so when the Redeemer does come from Zion, thus all Israel will be saved. But it doesn't mean every last Israelite who begins the tribulation period or even comes all the way through the tribulation period. Just because, I made it. I made it through all of the persecutions of Antichrist, but I don't believe in Jesus. I am still going to work my way to God. He's going to get the shepherd's crook. You don't get to go in. You're taken away. So when it says he who endures to the end shall be saved, I don't think it's just the tribulation period. It's also enduring to the end and coming in to into the kingdom means that one is fully and totally delivered. So yeah. In the end, it is a full and total national salvation. But it's a national salvation because they will come to understand who Jesus is. They'll repent. They'll embrace Jesus. They'll embrace the message of the gospel. And on that basis, they will be saved. Chapters 34 and 35. Jeremiah deals with two events here. He deals with what takes place under Zedekiah when the siege was taking place in 589 BC as the siege, and 588 BC as the siege comes upon Jerusalem. What Zedekiah and the princes do is they release their Israelite slaves, their Hebrew servants. And then when there is from Egypt a slight release, in other words, while Nebuchadnezzar continues to besiege the a part of his army goes to fight against the Egyptians, when they see that take place, they say, a real possibility of the fact that we're not going to be captured and destroyed like Jeremiah says, so we reinstitute our bondage of these slaves that we previously released. And of course, Jeremiah says, see, here is the basic problem with Judah. You are not faithful to covenants. You can actually free slaves and then turn right around when you think the consequences are ameliorated and re-enslave them. And so here's the root cause of Jerusalem's judgment: the failure to keep covenant loyalty. Within this context, the loyalty to their slaves. And so because of this, Jeremiah at the end of chapter 34 reminds them again they're covenant transgressors, and God is going to bring his destruction upon them. And yet previous to that, in the days of Jehoiakim, and Jeremiah doesn't say exactly when, but, and we don't know a whole lot about these Rechabites and where they came from, other than their father had told them and pledged them to covenants that they would not drink wine. And so Jeremiah tempts them to see if they would drink wine, and they were faithful. And he says now, in chapter 35, this is the kind of faithfulness that God was looking for in Judah. Now, he's not saying the Rechabites were under the Mosaic covenant, were faithful to the Mosaic covenant. He is just using them as examples of covenant faithfulness, covenant obedience. And saying, now you Judeans should learn a lesson from them. There is a pledge made, and nothing will keep the Rechabites from fulfilling the covenant stipulations. And so we have here in chapters 34 and 35 an emphasis upon obedience to covenant, obedience to an oath that is made. The Rechabites are faithful, and that should have been an example to Judah, who was unfaithful, and because of their unfaithfulness, God is going again to bring his judgment upon them. And so Jeremiah is emphasizing again the aspect of covenant unfaithfulness as foundational to the judgments that is coming upon Jerusalem. And because of their covenant unfaithfulness, therefore the words of Jeremiah are going to be fulfilled. And it's interesting, chapters 36 to 45 begin with the chapter we have looked at again during the time of Jehoiakim, when Jeremiah sends the scroll and Jehoiakim cuts it up and throws it in the fire as an indication that he is not listening and hearing and heeding the words of Jeremiah. Now, by this point in the book of Jeremiah, we know very, very well what his basic message was to that generation. All right, surrender to Babylon. There is no hope because there's no covenant loyalty, no covenant faithfulness, no repentance on the part of Jerusalem and Judah. Therefore, the word of the Lord is certainly going to come to pass as far as the desolation of the land is concerned. Now, obviously, that message, as we have already seen in the chapters 2 through 20, was being given by Jeremiah both during the time of Josiah and the time of Jehoiakim, before we get to, obviously, the outworking of that within the exiles, and ultimately his words to the remnant that was left after 597 BC, that this is certainly what God is going to do. All right? Jehoiakim doesn't want to hear. He cuts it up. That's an indication of his hard-heartedness. Well, you might cut up the word, but in the end, the word cuts you up, is to use a pun, and what takes place in chapters 37 to 44. Because what we see within these chapters is the historical outworking of Jeremiah's word. So that in chapter 37, because he says the Egyptians will not save Judah from Nebuchadnezzar, he's beaten, he's put in prison. And he's in the courtyard of the guard. In fact, in chapter 38, if it wasn't for the faithfulness of Ebed-Melech, who was Zedekiah's also seeking to get Jeremiah to give him a good word, which he won't do. So he has to stay under arrest. And we see the intense suffering in chapters 37 and 38 that Jeremiah goes through, even as the siege of the Babylonians is taking place. And of course, it's during his time of imprisonment when he exercises the buying of the land that is seen in chapter 32. But in the end, Jeremiah's words come true in chapter 39, where the city is captured and destroyed, and yet Jeremiah is released. And he is rescued and released by the Babylonians in chapter 40 and allowed to go free. But does really anything change as far as the Judeans and their relationship with Jeremiah, even after the destruction of the city, the temple, and Jeremiah is released to stay in the land with a small, raggedy group that is left by the Babylonians under Gedaliah? No, this group assassinates Gedaliah. Jeremiah says, all right, you should not have done this, but now stay within the land. They refuse. Take and bind Jeremiah and take him with Egypt. And so what we see through chapter 44 is, Jeremiah, even after his word comes to pass, the Judeans still refuse to listen to him. And just as he begins in chapters 37 and 38 during the siege to be bound, well, he's even taken to Egypt bound. Poor Jeremiah, before the destruction, after the destruction, he finds himself, speaking the word of God and just being persecuted for it. And of course, it's within that context, although he reiterates words that he had given to Baruch when he had first written down the message that God was going to bless Baruch for writing down the message and being responsive to the words of Jeremiah in a way that the Judeans, even through 585 BC, were not. And so historically, really, in chapters 43 and 44, we see the end of Jeremiah's ministry at what in the text is the end of his life. After 585, nothing further is said about the circumstances of Jeremiah. And then going back to chapter 1, they opposed him from the very beginning, and they oppose him even to the end when God has validated him as a legitimate prophet because his word has come to pass. It's not the words of the false prophets that have come to pass, it's the words of Jeremiah. And he is still suffering for that at the very end, as we see the accomplishments of Jeremiah's words, and yet the continued failure on the part of the Judeans to obey the word of the Lord through Jeremiah. Gentlemen, how you like to end your ministry with a clear recognition through events that you are a true prophet from God. You have spoken the word of God faithfully for over 40 years, ridiculed, had plots against your life, been beaten, suffered physically, emotionally during that time, and even as the grand finale, when you are a validated prophet, you're still not listened to. You still find yourself physically and emotionally tormented for speaking the word of God. That was Jeremiah's experience. Now in chapters 46 to 51, we have the oracles against the nations. Wish we had time to get into this. Obviously, he speaks from different time periods of his ministry. He collects together these oracles of judgment, interestingly, beginning with Egypt in chapter 46. Where has he just been taken? Egypt. And ends in chapters 50 and 51 with Babylon. Where have the exiles gone? Babylon. Well, God is going to bring his judgment both upon Egypt and he is going to bring his judgment upon Babylon as well. And yet even within these passages, we can't get into it because of time. But as you read them through, you'll see echoes as the nations are judged of Israel's restoration. And even in the middle chapters, we hear echoes like we did in Isaiah of the nation's restoration ultimately as well. So that for both the nations and for Israel, God's word, yes, then was a word of judgment, which was certainly going to come. But even in the oracles of judgment, Jeremiah can look beyond and see that for Israel and for at least some of the nations. And of course, this is not the major burden of his oracles, as also seen in Isaiah. He really is bringing messages of judgment, but beyond the judgments, there are hints and glimpses of the restoration that will come. And then the book ends in chapter 52, as we've already seen, with an appendix that once again reiterates what has been seen in 1 Kings 24-25 as far as the destruction of Jerusalem. And yet, like Kings, this ends with a note of restoration of Jehoiachin upon the death of Nebuchadnezzar, with an anticipation that we've also seen in Kings, that this is not God's final word, that the Davidic house continues to endure. And even though it won't be a physical son of Jehoiachin, nevertheless, the Davidic house continues to exist. And so there is a possibility of God's word of restoration coming to pass in the future. And so really, Jeremiah, chapter 52 is like the book in a miniature. That even though most of the book is pretty depressing on what has taken place as God has brought the curse of the covenant upon the people, yet nevertheless, there is a glimmer of hope at the very end of the book. Just as having read the first 51 chapters is basically depressing, but there are glimmers of hope, particularly centered in chapters 30 to 33 of what God is going to do in the future. Well, Jeremiah, just the word about preaching Jeremiah. Jeremiah is a book that should be preached. If, as I said, as we came to Jeremiah, if there's one book in the Old Testament that's been ignored by friend and foe during the 20th century, it is the book of Jeremiah. Less commentaries, less articles. As I tell people, I don't think in 1899 a group of evangelical and developing liberal scholars got together in a room someplace in Europe and said, you know, for the next 100 years, let's ignore Jeremiah. Let's just act as though it really isn't in the Bible. This is no human conspiracy. But why do you think, having read it, that Jeremiah has been ignored in the 20th century by scholar and preacher alike? It's because we don't like the message. You know, the 20th century began in both evangelical and liberal circles, at least in Western Christendom, when this is the Christian century. This is the century of progress. Even evangelicals had just come out of the great century of missions in the 19th century, like we're going to conquer the world with the gospel. You got to realize that as the 20th century began, post-millennialism was the dominant eschatology of both liberalism and evangelicalism in the United States. Now, if you're marching to victory, I'm a Christian soldiers marching on to war, and we're going to win the victory, who wants to read Jeremiah? And even after what the events that has taken place during the last 100 years, we still have a glib mentality within our society that day by day things are getting better and better. And that has invaded the church. Evangelicals today, and have thought throughout the 20th century, we're on the verge of revival. Just read the literature. Well, Ezekiel's not, we'll get to Ezekiel in just a second. Jeremiah is not a book to preach when everyone is believing in revival is right around the corner. Because Jeremiah's message is what? Judgment is right around the corner for your sin. Israel, Judah, and Judah at this point, historically. Because of your hard-heartedness, stubbornness, rebellion against God, God is bringing the full weight of his curses upon you. It is a book of imminent judgments. And as we've already seen, judgment is a necessary step before God will restore. And Jeremiah, as much as any book in the Old Testament, pulls apart the heart of man and says, see, it is deceitful and desperately wicked, who can know it? And that's why we need Jeremiah. Because we need to come to grips and understand the utter sinfulness of sin and the consequences that it has for the sinner. And the fact that, and let's face it, for all of us, judgment is only a generation away. Not in a physical sense, but in a spiritual sense. We're all a generation away from facing the judge. And so Jeremiah, I think, as you start to learn of Jeremiah's days, beginning with Josiah, when there's revival on the outside, but the heart of people is not changed. And you can go through the 20th century. You know, basically, the heart of the church, the heart of confessing Christendom has not been changed by anything external. And today, the church is still committed to externals. We think that somehow if we can change things externally, we'll be okay. A little bigger church, a little better, I shouldn't say that. A new paint job just around the buildings, things might be looking better. And I'm not saying that the church shouldn't be painted. Don't get me wrong, but if that's all those things, that's just an imagery of what so many churches are doing. So if we change the paint, we're kind of sprucing everything up on the outside, everything will be okay. We're dealing with externals, and God is dealing with the heart. And we see that in Jeremiah. Now, in preaching Jeremiah, gentlemen, I have never done a verse-by-verse exposition of the book. It's probably my failure, not Jeremiah's. I have not preached it in the same way that Jeremiah wrote it for the exilic generation and continuing Word of God to today. I have to admit, I tend to give 5 or 6 messages on judgment in Jeremiah and kind of overview some of some of the chapters and then concentrate upon, chapter 2 and chapter 10, chapter 11 with the broken covenant, chapter 18 with the potter, and give pretty much equal weight then to restoration. I am still, as I share with you, in awe of Philip Ryken, who would literally go through chapter by chapter, verse by verse, the whole book of Jeremiah. I think it's both a credit to him and, as I said, a credit to a congregation that would listen to it week in and week out. I don't think I've ever had a congregation that would want to hear Jeremiah week in and week out. Because, gentlemen, if you got 52 chapters, let's put it this way, you got 48 where the theme is basically what? Judgment. You got 4 chapters of restoration. And I'm not sure that in this day and age in which we live, that's about the balance our churches need to hear during the year. 48 messages of the imminency of judgments. And 4 Sundays on and beyond the judgment, there is hope. The same God who tore down is the same God who will build up. But you got to let God tear down. Tear down your idols. Tear down your flesh. Come to realize how desperately wicked we are before the Lord, as was Judah, to then hear his words of restoration. We live in a day and an age where people need to know they're lost so they might hear God's word of salvation. And we have people who don't come to grips with the reality of salvation because they've never come to grips with the reality of sin in their life. And Jeremiah is a book that will bring that to the heart and to the mind. And can I say this? None of us are ready to preach Jeremiah until Jeremiah is preached to us, until we have grabbed the message and have applied it to our own lives. And then we can proclaim it to others. Well, that's preaching Jeremiah. I didn't give you any specifics as much as the big thrust on why Jeremiah is a book that still needs to be heard in our churches today. Well, then we move into Ezekiel, a contemporary, a younger contemporary of Jeremiah. In fact, if the 30th year that is referred to in verse 1 of Ezekiel is the 30th year of his life, and it is a passage that is difficult to understand. It came about in the 30th year. The 30th year of what? Well, the text doesn't say. So because of that, your interpretation is as good as anybody else's. I started reading this in my 30th year. No reader response hermeneutic in this class. But it's the 30th year. The 30th year of what? Well, the predominant interpretation, where I would lead, is the 30th year of Ezekiel's life, which means he is born in 623 BC. About 4 years after Jeremiah has been called to his prophetic ministry. Right around the time he is born when the book of the law is found within the temple. 2 Kings chapter 22. Now, in the chart I gave you, Dan Block, for some reason, puts with a question mark his birth in 627 BC. I haven't figured out why he put it there, but I just figured, well, he's got the major commentary on the book, and he puts with a question mark, so I did the same. Ezekiel, strengthened by God, or a call, be strengthened by God. And certainly that, like Jeremiah, is going to be a theme in Ezekiel. Just as Jeremiah had been said, they're strong, I'm going to make you stronger. The same thing with Ezekiel. We'll take a look at it on Friday. The opponents are going to come at you with everything they got. I'm going to make you stronger than them. And that's in his name, strengthened by God. And Ezekiel is not quite the prayer that Jeremiah was. That is within the text of the book. So probably strengthened by God rather than, God strengthened me. Ezekiel, unlike Jeremiah and Isaiah, gives us within his book the dating of every statement within the text on when he receives it from the Lord. And from the words that are given, you can see we can plot it, and there's a chart to this effect also in the study Bible. But you can see where we can get right down to the day, not quite the hour, but the very day in now our calendars when Ezekiel received the oracles that are presented within the text. Therefore, we can, and you have this chart that has been given to you, we can chart, at least beginning with the initial induction into ministry in 593 BC, we can chart the whole book of Ezekiel as far as its historical background is concerned. So we can Ezekiel will date his book even as he begins that this is in the 5th month of the 5th year of King Jehoiachin's exile. He was taken exile with Jehoiachin when he was approximately, if the 30 years is his age, 26 years of age. In fact, we can get some idea, even as we take a look at his birth. Basically, for the first 14 years of his life, he lives under Josiah, at least an outward time of conformity to the law. Then, in his period from 14 to 26, he lives during a time that we've already seen from Jeremiah, where there was both hypocrisy on the outside, but sin that was rampant. And let me come back up here from the birth from Ezekiel. And in his 26th year, he's taken to Babylon. He is one of the important people, and we will find out that he was of a priestly family. In fact, he is referred to in 1:3 as Ezekiel the priest. So he is from the Aaronic family, and he is one of those influential, important people that is taken with Jehoiachin to Babylon. And throughout Ezekiel, all of his ministry, he is in Babylon. Now he'll be taken by vision to Jerusalem in chapters 8 to 11. He'll be taken to vision again to Jerusalem in chapters 40 and following. But his body will always be where? Babylon. So, 26 years of age, he is taken to Babylon, and there he will live the rest of his life. And it's in Babylon where from 593 to 521, a period of 22 years, Ezekiel will receive the words that he writes within this book. Words that were given to the exiles. Realize that that Ezekiel is speaking to the exiles in Babylon from beginning to end of the book. Jeremiah might send a letter, Jeremiah 29. Ezekiel is there in their midst. And just as God has one faithful prophet that goes through the whole generation leading up to the destruction of Jerusalem in Judea. That is Jeremiah. At the same time, here comes this younger contemporary who God will raise up in his 30th year in Babylon to then have a 22-year ministry, faithfully giving the word of the Lord to those who were in Babylon. Those who went in 605, those who particularly were there in 597 BC, and of course those who will join them of the captives who come in 586 BC. This is going to be the focus of Jeremiah's ministry. It's going to be to the exiles. Now, so you can have some idea of what was taking place in the ancient world. All right, the third chart gives you some idea of what was happening historically as Ezekiel was giving his oracles. And I've already emphasized this, and it's in your notes to conclude the introduction. This is where we'll end today. That the first recipients of these prophecies are the exiles in Babylon. All right, so as Ezekiel speaks, when the elders come to him and ask for a word from the Lord, these are the leaders of the exilic community in Babylon. When Jeremiah speaks about the rebels to whom he is sent, these are the exiles in Babylon. These are the good figs of Jeremiah 24. And so we're saying it's not because of inherent goodness they're good figs, it's because God is going to, from the exile, bring the restoration in the future. He's proclaiming the word to the good figs of Jeremiah chapter 24. All right, we will find out about his ministry to these exiles and how God uses him, and his words that then will have continual relevance for Israel, both then in exile and into the future. We'll pick it up at that point on Friday.